This episode of Metatrex is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
There's no greater challenge than the study of philosophy.
My philosophy is that there is room for all philosophies on this station.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 92 of Metatrex, Trek FM's show on Star Trek and philosophy. My name is Mike Morrison, and with me, as always, is Zachary Fruhling. Today, we're going to be discussing the first season of Star Trek Discovery on our Essential Trek Philosophy podcast. Zachary, how are you?
I'm doing great, Mike. It's good to be recording 2 podcasts in as many weeks.
I know, that's fantastic, and I'm excited about this because, Zachary, as you know, we have gotten quite a few requests for an Essentials focused on the first season of Star Trek Discovery. And it's great timing because as we're recording this, we are 2 days away from the premiere of Season 2. So in a few short months, we'll have a whole other season of Star Trek Discovery to talk about. But we wanted to pause for a moment and reflect back upon the first season of this newest iteration of Star Trek Discovery, and put our own Essentials spin to it, choose a few episodes, and kind of talk about the season as a whole.
I have to be honest about this, Mike. I've kind of been avoiding doing an Essential Trek Philosophy episode on Star Trek Discovery, partly because Discovery is complicated. It is not a series of isolated episodes or standalone episodes like you get in The Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, so it's very hard to treat them in isolation. Any philosophical themes are drawn out over a series of episodes. They're woven in with a bunch of other themes, political themes and dramatic themes, epic themes, things that are hard to characterize philosophically. So I really struggled to come up with a discrete number of episodes and a discrete number of topics that we can talk about in terms of essential Trek philosophy.
I agree, and you and I kicked this around for quite a long time. We had several conversations in the turbo lift. You know, should we do one now? No, let's hold off, let's wait. But the timing seemed right, and it's good to kind of go back and reflect on the season as we prepare for the second season. I have to say, by and large, this is a great time to be a Star Trek fan. I'm blown away by the reception that Discovery received and how it has really opened the doors to a number of Star Trek series that are in development. And that's definitely exciting. This is a great time to be a Star Trek
You know
fan.
what that means? We have committed ourselves to doing an Essential Trek Philosophy on every season of all the new series of Star Trek that are in development.
Yeah, and the difficult thing about that for me is that, and I found that's the case here with Star Trek Discovery. I've seen each of these episodes in the Discovery series 3 times now, and my familiarity with Star Trek Discovery isn't even close to what it is for, say, the original series or Next Gen or Enterprise. So for me to sit down and watch these for the sheer entertainment of it, and then to kind of go back and take a deeper dive and to try to look at them through the eyes of someone who is looking for those philosophical and theological themes, that's challenging for me. But I will say, for all the criticism about Star Trek Discovery, you know, the fans out there who say, this isn't Star Trek, I have to say that going back and really looking at these episodes through the eyes of someone who is interested in philosophy and theology, who's interested in the ethical plays, who really pays attention to dialogue and writing, I've got to say, Star Trek Discovery is definitely Star Trek. I think they did a great job this first season. You're absolutely right. A lot of the themes are kind of woven over and throughout varying episodes. Sometimes it's back-to-back episodes, and then they'll take a theme and they'll weave it in. It might skip an episode or two, especially in the later part of the season. You'll see these philosophical themes kind of crop up again, where they pick up a storyline and, here we are talking about Ash Tyler's identity crisis again. And so we've got these themes that keep kind of popping up that are woven throughout, and it's really difficult to isolate a single episode and say, I'm interested in this particular philosophical thread because, that thread might be present in 4, 5, 6 episodes.
I don't know if it's because I'm getting older. I don't know if it's because I'm busier than I used to be. I don't know if it's because I watched way too much Star Trek in the 90s and I'm just used to that style of Star Trek. I don't know if it's because I've spent so much time skimming for quick information for work rather than reading long novels. Like I would much rather read a short story nowadays than read War and Peace. I just don't have time to do that. And that's part of my problem with watching Discovery. I just almost don't have the time it takes to follow that storyline. Even when I've watched it a couple of times now, and I still have trouble following all the details, keeping track of all the plots, seeing how it weaves together. My mind just doesn't seem to function that way at this point in my life anymore. So, I think that combined with the fact that themes are drawn out over multiple episodes means it's really hard to pinpoint and point to a specific section of Discovery as the most philosophically relevant pieces of it.
That's true, and perhaps getting a younger perspective might be beneficial here. I'm a good bit older than you are. However, for me, I have a more episodic mindset. So, if I want to watch Star Trek, I want to sit down and watch an episode of Star Trek, and I might even binge watch 2 or 3. But with Star Trek Discovery, it's very, very difficult to sit down and just watch an isolated episode because, these threads, again, they're just woven throughout, and storylines kind of mesh combined. The writing is very complex, I think, in that way. And there's something satisfying about it when I'm able to sit down and watch a lot of it all at once. But I'm an old dude, and I'm a bit more episodic in that way.
I think it's clear from the first season that even though the season ended, Star Trek Discovery is just beginning. So the writers didn't plan to even bookend an entire season. We're just beginning the things that are going to be relevant to Star Trek Discovery as a whole. Like, there are going to be these grand themes across the entire series, I have no doubt, that we're just starting to see the fruits of. So I feel like that limits our ability to say what those themes really are, because we don't know where the show is going and how the seeds that were sown in the first season are going to play into the rest of the series.
I know when this was originally pitched, long before we had the very first episode of Discovery, it was kind of pitched as an anthology type series. And so my expectation was that it would be maybe 5 episodes or maybe even an entire season focused on this crew, and then we would kind of pick up and we would go to something else. And so I personally was surprised when we got to Will You Take My Hand, and it leaves on this giant cliffhanger that really said to me that, as you said, the journey of Discovery has just begun.
Before we start talking about specific episodes and specific philosophical themes, I was struck in general by how contemporary the show feels. It delves into some theoretical physics. It delves into some issues in contemporary biology. It's dark in a non-idealistic kind of way, and there are some threads of Star Trek idealism inside Discovery, and like I said, I think we're going to get there. I think the writers are taking a little time to get there. But for me, it feels a little dark, and I kind of miss that 1990s idealism and optimism from The Next Generation and from Voyager and Deep Space Nine to some extent too. But I feel like some of the things that are most interesting about Discovery aren't so much philosophy in general. It's the character-based narrative, and it's almost epic in quality. Like there's a journey that's going on in this epic sense. It's a little more contemporary than like classical epics like the Odyssey and the Iliad, things like that. But it does seem a little similar to the Odyssey. You know, they're out there on the frontier. It's a dark time. There's a war. Of course, the Odyssey takes place after a war, but this is kind of leading up to a war in the beginnings of the Klingon War. And it has that epic quality to it. And I think that's where I find the interest in it, not so much in the philosophical issues. And part of my worry about the philosophical issues is that they delve into things that I would consider a little more on the side of fantasy than things that are well-grounded in science or things that are well-grounded in philosophical ideals. And it's all for the sake of serving a story. And you can't fault writers for doing that because the primary interest is telling a compelling story. But I feel like where the series delves into things that are supposed to be well-grounded in science, it actually errs on the side of wildly speculative science versus things that are well-grounded. So to me, the whole series feels a little more in the realm of fantasy and a little less in the realm of well-grounded scientific Star Trek.
You said a couple of things there, Zachary, that I thought were very interesting. First of all, you talked about Discovery in terms of this epic, and I couldn't agree with that statement more. I really feel like maybe a working title for Star Trek Discovery really is the Epic of Michael Burnham, because we are seeing a very epic journey take place for her as she grows and develops, and we're digging into her backstory, and we're really taking a deep dive into her relationships. And so that's very interesting. It's also very unique because more than probably any other Star Trek series, most of which are, you have this collaborative effort going on, and it's about the ensemble, the entire cast. And while some cast members tend to get more storylines or more development, even within other iterations of Star Trek, I really feel like this, at least this first season, was very much about the epic journey of Michael Burnham. You also mentioned the word fantasy, and again, that's something that I agree with. I think what really separates this from the Star Trek probably that we're used to is that other iterations of Star Trek tend to lean heavily upon the familiar science fiction tropes and the technobabble I think that most of us are used to when we sit down and we watch Star Trek. And there are no Geordie PowerPoints here on Star Trek Discovery. And a lot of the familiar science fiction tropes have been thrown out the airlock, and they are telling stories that I think are very similar to something that you would get in a fantasy genre.
If there are no Geordie PowerPoints, there are at least some Stamets keynotes. I want to return for just a minute to this question of Michael Burnham as an epic character. That's one of the hallmarks of epic characters. They're on a journey, whether it's Odysseus on his way back from Troy, whether it is Dante being led through hell and purgatory and paradise by Virgil and Beatrice. These are characters that have something to discover about themselves, something to work through, internal issues that are become writ large in the obstacles they have to overcome in the course of their journey. Do you have a sense in your mind of which epic character, which classical epic theme, or which epic narrative that Michael Burnham is closest to?
It's interesting that you mentioned Dante, because this last time that I sat down and I watched, I was able to binge watch a lot of the episodes over the course of just a few days. And I had that thought literally while I was sitting there watching about midway through the season of season 1. I had that thought that Michael Burnham, her journey is very similar, I think, to what we get in Dante, with the exception that, Michael's not midway through life's journey. She's in some ways just getting started, but she's taking a very similar path, and there are characters who come in, and I think of, for instance, her relationship with Giorgio, and you have other characters who come in along the way. Ash Tyler, I think, is part of that, kind of leading her, and her friendship with Tilly, kind of bringing that sense of innocence and that giddy kind of childlike point of view of life and of the universe. And then you have much darker characters like Lorca, who take her under his wing. And so I think that there's a very Dante-esque journey happening here for Michael Burnham.
Well, what you don't get in classical epic so much is the lone gunman classical epic hero, right? The epic heroes always have someone, oftentimes more than one someone, helping them along the way. In the case of Dante that we mentioned, he's got Virgil and he's got Beatrice. In the case of Odysseus, he's got the gray-eyed goddess Athena helping him along the way, and various other characters. And I feel like that's what's going on with Michael Burnham. Michael Burnham has these other ancillary characters that are helping her along her development in different ways as she overcomes her internal obstacles and the external obstacles. But she is still the main focus of the series.
Yeah, even Saru, who in many ways is an adversary, I think does quite a lot to give her perspective along her journey. So again, my mind goes back to, this is a very Dante type story that they're telling. And I have to say, I love it. I love that aspect of it, because I think it brings a layer into the Star Trek universe that perhaps we're not necessarily used to, but it's very satisfying, especially if you're a lover of classical stories.
Well, like at the beginning of the Inferno, midway through life's journey, Dante went astray. That's how the Inferno opens. That's essentially what's gone on with Michael Burnham.
That's exactly what's going on.
Yeah, somewhere along the journey, she went astray, and she's essentially been banished, just like Dante was banished. That's a really interesting connection I hadn't thought about until today.
She is Michael Burnham, quote unquote, the mutineer.
It's so interesting you say that she's Michael Burnham, the mutineer, because that is also a hallmark of classical epic literature. You have characters that don't just have names; they have epithets.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Zachary, let's remind our listeners a little bit about how we do Essential Trek Philosophy. It's been a little while, so we'll give a friendly reminder. You and I have compiled a list of a few episodes. There are only 15 in the season, so I don't think it makes sense. You and I both agree that a few episodes is plenty. We haven't shared our list. I don't know what's on your list. You don't know what's on my list. We're simply going to share our lists and discuss those episodes, not in whole. This is not intended to be any kind of deep dive into what's going on in the episodes, but we'll certainly touch on some of the highlights and what we thought was interesting. And who knows, at the end of the podcast, we may have 6 or 8 episodes. We may agree completely and just have a few, but at the end, we'll have an epic list of Essential Trek Philosophy for Discovery Season 1.
I should say, too, that my picks in general when we do an Essential Trek Philosophy are somewhat contingent on what I find interesting at the moment. You know, my philosophical thoughts and philosophical interests are always evolving as I think about different issues, as I'm exposed to different ideas, as I look back on things I've read, sometimes years before, make new connections between things. So my list is always very much what I'm interested in this week. If we were going to do this episode... If we were going to do this episode of Metatreks on Discovery Season 1 a year from now or 5 years from now, I probably would have a different list, honestly. But my list is what I'm interested in today. And that's a good segue into my first pick. And my first pick is Context is for Kings. And the reason I picked that is right now, I'm finding myself completely fascinated by the concept of emergence. The idea that we live in a complex world where more complex things are constantly evolving or emerging from simpler things. If you look back at the entire history of the universe, that's what we see. We started with the Big Bang, then we had hydrogen, and helium permeating the microscopic universe. As the universe cooled, we started to get chemistry, and out of chemistry, we get geology here on Earth. Out of geology and chemistry, we get the emergence of life. Then we get complex life. Then we get beings like us that are able to reason and think and have ideas and all the things that humans do. And all of that takes billions of years to evolve. So that's what I'm interested in right now, philosophically, how new things emerge out of things that don't yet exist in this kind of novel, unpredictable way. So I'm completely fascinated by this idea of physics as biology that you get in Context is for Kings. I think what's hard about this episode philosophically is that what you don't get, I think in all of Discovery, honestly, I don't think you get well-developed philosophical ideas. I think you get seeds of ideas. I think you get interesting connections between ideas, but I don't think you get like little microcosms of well-developed ideas like you get in a Star Trek The Next Generation episode where they take a moral conundrum, develop it, and lead it to a nice, concise resolution by the end of the episode. We get interesting ideas that are drawn out to their logical conclusion, but we don't get them wrapped up with a neat little bow in Star Trek Discovery. And so in terms of physics as biology, I think that's an interesting idea that in Star Trek The Next Generation, and to some extent all of Star Trek, I would say physics has been emphasized more than biology. Yes, we have doctors and we have biologists in Starfleet, but physics is like the fundamental science in Star Trek. It's interesting to see that turned on its head, to think of biology as somehow more fundamental to the fabric of the universe than physics. This idea that spores are an energy source that permeates the universe or is important to all life. Or I even struggled to talk about it. I'm not sure exactly what the heck these spores are. They mentioned panspermia inside the episode, this idea that maybe they're the seeds of all life, or they're the energy source of all life, or all life is connected in this deep kind of metaphysical way. Again, that's not a well-developed idea inside the episode, so it's hard to know exactly how to interpret it. And I guess that's my fundamental question. What the heck are these spores? They're supposed to be philosophically interesting. They're supposed to be scientifically interesting. They're related to this idea that physics isn't necessarily the fundamental science. And I think that's one of the interesting hallmarks of emergence theory, that as new levels of reality emerge out of simpler forms, what emerges are new properties that have their own laws and their own concepts and their own causal relations that need to be looked at their own level, that aren't necessarily reducible to the concepts and the entities and the causal relations that are happening at a lower level of reality. So it's interesting to have a Star Trek episode come along and say, well, biology is the fundamental level of reality, that physics is somehow subordinate to biology in some way.
And that seems so counterintuitive to Star Trek as a whole, because I feel like by and large it's exactly opposite of the message that we get in any other iteration of Star Trek. I agree. That's very fascinating. One of the things that I appreciate about this episode is that I think it plays very well on what I believe, Zachary, is an overall theme, I think, that has woven itself throughout the series, or at least throughout this first season, and that is this idea of identity. I love the name Discovery because it not only is it the name of the ship that we seem to be focused on here in this series, but I think it's also telling of what I believe the writers, producers, creators of Star Trek Discovery really want to accomplish here. I think they're asking a question: who are we? I think that question is very broad in a sense of saying, who are we as a species? I think it can become more focused to say, who we are in this moment as Americans or as Britons or Canadians or whatever the case may be. I think there's definitely some themes of nationalism. I think
way to anglicize things, Mike.
Well, I'm sorry.
Way to anglicize things.
But I think it also asks the question. I think that can become even more focused. I think Michael Burnham is asking the question who she is. And it's interesting because there are these fascinating little clues. For instance, as I go back and I watch it, I don't know how I missed that Gabriel Lorca was from the Mirror Universe. There are these beautiful little clues that are written into the dialogue, and the title of this episode really comes from something he says, "Context is for kings." But I love the statement that he makes before that, and it is this: universal law is for lackeys. I love that comment because it's so telling of who he is as a person. Michael Burnham has a statement, I think, that really defines her character throughout this series. If you had any doubts as to what kind of person Michael Burnham is, she says to Gabriel Lorca, "Before I was a mutineer, I was a first officer in Starfleet. I'll never bear that rank or any other again, but it is who I am and who I will always be." And so as I think about that dialogue and I think about how these characters in this episode are really defining themselves, we know that Lorca is shady because he believes that universal law is for lackeys. There are no absolutes in his world. Everything's a shade of gray. We know that Michael Burnham is black and white in a lot of ways, even though her actions have indicated otherwise. She knows that at her core, she is Starfleet. She is someone who lives her life by the principles of the United Federation of Planets. And I think Janeway would be very proud to have her on her crew.
Yeah, I think Janeway would take in Michael Burnham, absolutely, in the same way that she takes in 7 of 9. Yeah, I could see that. So I want to get back to what your point was about Lorca. Is he, or Mirror Lorca more properly, right?
Yes.
He's kind of a Machiavellian figure.
Very much so.
I hesitate to call him like a Nietzschean Übermensch because, in really Nietzsche's concept of an Übermensch is more positive than we see in Lorca. Yes. I would describe Lorca as a bit more Machiavellian, and rules just don't apply to me. He can, in any means justify his own ends.
So Zachary, my first episode, and I'm going to just confess right now, I've cheated a little bit. I actually have 2 episodes that I think are very difficult to separate, and that is the very beginning, episode 1 and 2, The Vulcan Hello and Battle at the Binary Stars, I think are the setup for this overall story. As we open up, we see something I think that's very akin to The Next Generation. I think it's the 4th season, about midway through episode 9 or 10, Final Mission with Captain Picard and Wesley Crusher. We have Michael Burnham and Captain Giorgio out in the desert, walking around having a conversation. And it's really this beautiful mentoring moment where, the captain is putting her arm around Michael Burnham and really making her think and answer questions. And Michael Burnham is thinking about her next step as an officer, and she's thinking about command, and then all hell kind of breaks loose from there. Enter the Klingons and enter the standoff and the Battle of the Binary Stars and the mutiny and so on and so forth. All of that wonderful setup that takes place on the heels of this very kind of final mission scene that takes place at the beginning. And it plays into, again, what I think this overall theme is, and it is identity over time. And this becomes this wonderful setup. And it's not just for Michael Burnham. It's not just for what's going on in Discovery. But we also have this amazing story that I think is ripped right off of the pages of today's newspapers and the cable talk shows, and that is this identity crisis that's taking place in the Klingon Empire. This very splintered empire that is 24 houses that desperately need to be united. You have a messiah figure in T'Kuvma who comes along and says, listen, we need to all rally around this idea that we need to hang on to our Klingonness. And he manages to at least get some support against the Federation. And as I said, everything kind of goes from there. But it's this wonderful exploration of what does it mean to be fill in the blank. For the Klingons, it's what does it mean to be Klingon? For Michael Burnham, it's what does it mean to be Michael Burnham? When we start out, she's Michael Burnham, the officer with endless potential and a bright future in Starfleet. By the time we get to the end of Battle at the Binary Stars, she is in the brig and her career is over, and everything that she ever could have hoped to be is gone.
See, I actually interpret this a slightly different way. We were talking about classical themes in literature before. I feel like what's going on with Michael Burnham in particular is the question of fate. Like Michael Burnham, she starts out a young, idealistic officer, all this potential, as you call it, but then fate intervenes. The Klingon War happens. She's involved in situations that force her down a different path, and she has to, I would say pay the price, but she has to go on a journey, a radically tangential journey of self-discovery and overcoming obstacles to become great, to reclaim that greatness. And I can't help but think of Odysseus in the Odyssey. Odysseus would have been a great farmer if the Trojan War hadn't happened, right? It's those struggles that made him great. I think Michael Burnham wanted to achieve greatness in the ordinary sense, but really it's overcoming these struggles and overcoming these obstacles, having to go on the journey, this epic journey that's going to make her an extraordinary figure. You know, even if she had achieved greatness in the ordinary sense, she would have been a very forgettable ordinary officer if none of these events had happened. So that's fate dealing her an interesting hand. Sure. So Michael Burnham has to go on a multi-year odyssey, essentially, to overcome obstacles, internal obstacles about herself and her identity, external obstacles in the situation that fate, in this classical Greek sense, has dealt her. In the same way that Odysseus has to, figure out who he is and becomes an extraordinary figure, an epic character in overcoming the obstacles and going off to the Trojan War and overcoming all the obstacles on the journey home. But I think it's those obstacles that made him great. I think it's a delusion for Michael Burnham to have thought that in being an ordinary young officer, Starfleet officer with lots of potential, that itself was going to achieve greatness. It's in overcoming those obstacles, in having to go on that epic journey over a series of years, potentially, that will give her that greatness in the same way that Odysseus had to, go to the Trojan Wars in order to be a memorable epic figure.
Yeah, I don't think we see this too differently. I think we're closer than probably we realize, because that is, I think, the overall arc, the overall theme of Star Trek Discovery. And I love the way that she's faced with Lorca, Mirror Lorca, as we keep mentioning, who I think represents one path that she can go down. And when she first meets him, I think that as a viewer, the first time through, I certainly didn't feel this way the second or third time, but the first time through, I had this sense, Zachary, and I don't know about you, I'd be interested to get your thoughts. I had this sense that he was a shady character. There was no doubt in my mind that he was not anything like the Starfleet captains that we are used to. And I had a sense that he probably was not an ethical captain. And I felt as though he represented one probable path that it looked like she might be going down. And there was a moment when I wasn't sure if she was going to be redeemable or not. Would she follow the path? Would he entice her to continue down a path of questionable choices and ethical compromises? And so I found that very, very satisfying as someone watching this for the first time, because she wasn't cut and dry.
It sounds to me like you're characterizing Lorca, again, continuing with the classical Greek themes, which is an interesting way to talk about Discovery in general, and these episodes in particular, that Lorca is one of the obstacles she has to overcome, in the same way that Odysseus has to overcome the Sirens, or has to overcome the Scylla and Charybdis, right?
Yes.
He is a diversion. If she goes down that path, she is going to end up a place where she doesn't want to be, or fill in the blank. Something bad's going to happen. But he's an obstacle on her journey in that classical sense.
I agree with that statement wholeheartedly, and that's exactly how I view him in the context of Star Trek Discovery. So for me, the Vulcan Hello, Battle of the Binary Stars, I can't really separate those as two episodes, even though they were presented to us as episode 1 and 2. I think they are a two-part episode that really is the setup for the entire series. Everything that we need to know about the journey that we're going to go on, I think they did a great job of presenting to us in these two episodes. Again, I love the way that it started like Final Mission, and it had a very TNG kind of feel to it when that scene first opened up in the desert. Immediately I went back to the 4th season of TNG, and instead of Picard and Wesley, it was Georgiou and Michael Burnham, and how it really takes a wild turn by the end of Battle of the Binary Stars. You're just sitting back saying, wow, this is going to be an incredible discovery of identity, and how this character Michael Burnham, and how the Klingons, and how the Federation, and how Discovery explores and discovers who they are as people, who they are as individuals. It's really a satisfying overall theme for me.
Well, what you're describing is kind of an epic scale story of existential self-discovery for at least a couple of the characters, right? At least for Michael Burnham, at least for, I mean, what other characters in Starfleet do you think, in Discovery, do you think have that quality? Maybe Stamets is having a similar issue.
I think Tilly.
Tilly, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Tilly to me, and I think most fans probably agree with this. I think she's a fan favorite for a reason, and it's almost interesting to me that if you don't think about it, she almost gets lost in the minutia of what's going on, and yet here is this brilliantly complex character. She is right out of the academy. She's wide-eyed, she's optimistic, and she is now in a wartime situation, and she's having to dig deep and really find out what she's made of. So Zachary, was the Vulcan Hello / Battle of the Binary Stars, were those episodes on your list?
They were not. Before we started recording, you and I had both mentioned that we each found it impossible to separate two episodes from each other. I thought maybe we picked the same two episodes. It turns out we didn't. I have two different episodes that I found impossible to separate conceptually.
Okay, and they are?
The Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry, and Choose Your Pain. And the reason I found those so difficult to separate conceptually is that they both, to some extent, deal with Ripper the tardigrade. And again, I don't know why I find this particularly interesting today, but I do. Just like I found issues of science and scientific ethics and some of the speculative science in Context is for Kings interesting, I find this to be a very sort of contemporary take on the animal research question. We've got this tardigrade that's essentially being imprisoned and used for scientific research and used to start, to develop weapons of war, essentially. I don't have much to say about it, but I think it raises these kind of just classical questions of animal research and medical ethics.
I think it definitely causes me to frown upon the idea of nipple clamps in animal research.
Yeah, they should be banned, right?
Zachary,
so conservative of you, Mike.
Yeah. I did not have these on my list, and I actually had the same thought early on as I was going through, and you and I have had a number of discussions here on the podcast about animal rights and ethics as it pertains to research, and so I felt like we had talked about these things. This is something that I don't think Star Trek at all is unfamiliar with as a franchise. We've explored this theme quite a bit through the course of varying iterations of Star Trek, from the original series all the way to Enterprise, and now here in Discovery. I think they did it in a bold and interesting way. Jokes about nipple clamps aside, I think they did a great job of just kind of adding a layer to that overall conversation and discussion, and they're excellent episodes without a doubt. I did not have them on my list simply because we've explored this here on the podcast, and certainly Star Trek has done a great job exploring this overall theme, I think, throughout varying iterations of Star Trek.
Yeah, I was struggling to think of anything unique that this episode adds that hasn't been dealt with in other iterations of Star Trek in this regard. I couldn't think of anything. I do think getting back to what we were talking about in terms of the context is for Kings. I think the deep connection that the tardigrade has to this fundamental reality that's somehow related to the spores in some way I don't understand. I think it's interesting in that sense. Like the tardigrade is a unique being in some way, but in terms of the animal rights and medical ethics and scientific research questions, I'm not sure the episode adds anything that hasn't been dealt with before.
It's funny because I remember when the big reveal of this creature happened, and I remember saying to my daughter, "Oh my gosh, that thing looks like a water bear." And so she pulls out her phone and she's Googling water bear, and now she's reading all this information about tardigrades, and it caused me to wonder how many millions of people are sitting around the world right now Googling tardigrades, trying to figure out what the heck this thing is modeled after. It's this microscopic little creature that really hadn't got very much press, and now you probably would be hard pressed to find a Star Trek fan that doesn't know what the heck a water bear is.
This is a bit of a stretch, but it kind of has this fractal quality to it that, if a creature like that can exist at the micro level, then at the macro level, you get an emergent pattern that has the same structure to it. That's kind of interesting in some way that's not super philosophical, but interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Voyager's done this before. With the macrovirus and
yeah, right, so, the macrovirus, right? This is Discovery's macrovirus.
Yeah, exactly. So I saw a lot of familiar things in there. I think probably more than any other episode of Star Trek Discovery. I think these two episodes, and I agree with you. I think it's hard to separate the two of them. These two episodes are, and we get mud as well. In Choose Your Pain, we get mud. So I think these episodes are very rooted in the overall lore and concept and idea of what Star Trek is about. I think they are the most connected to the overall lore of Star Trek probably than any other episodes within Star Trek Discovery Season 1. So, Zachary, I want to share my next pick, and it is Lethe. And I don't have a great deal to say about this other than it's one of those episodes that I don't think you can fully appreciate until you go back and you're rewatching the series. There is so much packed inside of this that is shadowed in mystery that I think what this episode is really about, you can't even begin to understand until you know the end of the story. It's as much about Ash Tyler and this pending identity crisis that he has, and the Klingons and what's going on internally with them. Michael Burnham trying to trying to find her way in this new situation that she's in on Discovery, trying to put the past behind her, trying to forget, as it were. We don't know that Lorca is Mirror Lorca, and he's certainly trying to forget, his past. This episode is all about forgetting, and you don't even realize what these characters are trying to forget without getting to the end and understanding where they came from and their overall story arc. So I love the mystery that's kind of shrouded in it, but yet the name is so telling, I think, and it really foreshadows what's to come. And again, I think it plays really well into what I've really latched onto here in Star Trek Discovery, and that is this question of identity.
But isn't life and self-discovery kind of like that? At any given moment, you've got whatever has led up to the present, and you can be bound by it, or you can kind of forget it metaphorically in the way that you just described. And you can reinvent yourself, or you can reinterpret things, or you can make a decision and go a different direction. Whatever it is, right? That's part of self-discovery at any phase of life. And I guess as I get older, I find that more and more interesting than I did when I was younger. Is it philosophically interesting? Yeah, in some sort of classical existentialist, 20th century existential way.
Yes. I really love kind of the metaphysical thing that's going on here as well, with the connection that Burnham has to Sarek. On a metaphysical level. I found that very interesting and very satisfying to explore. I mean, this is whole other facet of a Vulcan mind meld that we didn't even know existed. As a Star Trek fan, I'm sitting there, I'm going, wow, I had no idea that was possible. It's this ongoing link that exists between Michael Burnham and Sarek because of this mind meld that he had with her when she was a child.
Mike, I'm going to give you a Radio Shack joke because I know you and I both have Radio Shack experience. If this if this episode happened in the 1990s, they would have had prepaid long distance mind meld cards.
That's awesome.
You're welcome for that one.
Oh my gosh, that's
But no, this is the 2000s, so. Or the 2010s, no prepaid phone cards.
I mean, Michael's asking the question, Zachary, of Sarek in this long distance mind meld that they're having. Help me understand what you did. It could help us grow closer, not further apart. And so Sarek's trying to hide a choice, a decision that he made in his past to allow Spock an advantage and withhold that from Michael. And he's wrestled with this guilt, and it's caused this distance in the relationship that he has with Michael, if you can have distance in a Vulcan relationship. Kind of early lines in this episode, the young intern of Sarek's, they're having this conversation, and he asks Sarek, he said, "Can I inquire as to the nature of our diplomatic mission?" And Sarek says to him, "Allow me to be diplomatic and ask you that you do not. In times of crisis," he said, "ignorance can be beneficial." And so again, it's this wonderful line, I think, that's telling of something that's really going on here that a first-time viewer is not going to pick up on, and that is that everybody is wrestling with ignorance that may or may not be beneficial to them. Ash Tyler is wrestling with the ignorance of who he really is and doesn't even realize it. Michael Burnham is wrestling with the ignorance of what has caused this division in her relationship with Sarek, and really trying to come to terms with the shame, I think, that she feels, and letting him down as a father figure, that he took her in when she was orphaned, and he had high hopes and aspirations for her, and this is just one in the long line of disappointments. I appreciate that overall storyline that's going on in the episode, but I have to say that as you penned it, that long distance mind meld, that kind of metaphysical connectivity that exists between her and Sarek, I found very interesting. And as a Star Trek fan, someone who has steeped himself in the lore of Star Trek, I just want to say to the writers and to the producers, thank you. That is such an amazing little nugget. This new concept that you brought to what it is to mind meld. It's mind blown.
His brain is gone.
So other than that existential question, is there anything else about this episode that you find philosophically interesting?
Again, it's this overall existential question that I think is being asked throughout Star Trek Discovery. All my picks, honestly, I think are rooted in that. It is the theme that I latched onto. It's what I find interesting at this point in my life, and it might have something to do, Zachary, that I'm at a stage of life where I'm rediscovering classic literature, going back and rereading Greek classics, not just for my own personal discovery and personal reflection, but it's also very much a part of what I'm doing in the novels that I'm writing. Because they also have an exploration of the classic Greek world and Greek literature, and one of the main characters in the very first novel that's coming out in October is actually Hesiod, the prolific poet and philosopher from classic Greek history. Did this episode make it on your list, Zachary?
No, it didn't.
Wow, we are going in different directions. This is interesting because almost always we have a few picks, and there have been a couple of times when most of our picks were similar. So I think it's interesting. Our intuitions are a little different here.
Yeah, sometimes our choices are nearly unanimous, and sometimes we diverge radically. And this time we seem to be on different pages in terms of the first season of Discovery. So the last of my picks is the final episode, Will You Take My Hand?
Okay.
And not for a super deep reason. And in a way, I could have chosen the entire season for this reason, but really, I thought this episode was an interesting episode to pick about this philosophical topic. I think it's an interesting take on the question of what's justified in a time of war. Like, is genocide sometimes justified? When you're faced with potential extinction yourself. It's like being back in the state of nature, according to Thomas Hobbes, right? This idea that civilized society is less fundamental to our state of nature, which is warlike, nasty, brutish, and short, as he called it. And that when you're back in a time of war, it's like being thrown back into the state of nature. It's an us versus them situation. So there are no ethics, there are no rules, in terms of war from that standpoint. And this is an interesting question. Is something like genocide, justified when you're faced with the brink of extinction yourself?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up, because as I watched this, I found it interesting in the ethical plays throughout this first season of Discovery, how different I feel those ethical plays worked out. I think we're very much used to, and don't get me wrong, there are exceptions to this, but I feel like, let's call it classic Star Trek, tends to be very Kantian. In the way that it approaches these ethical plays. It's not uncommon to start an episode of Star Trek, especially The Next Generation, with, Captain, there's a planet in crisis. Okay, divert the Enterprise. We're going to do something about it, and that's a very Kantian kind of approach to a distress call,
or utilitarian, right? The classical dichotomy of Kantian ethics versus utilitarian ethics happens in most of 1990s Star Trek, right?
Yes,
you get these little ethical microcosms, and it forces you to ask the question: okay, we can harm this person to save these people, or we can take this to avoid this consequence. We can maximize utility for this group of people, but we harm these people in the process. But it's all very contained.
And so let me ask you, do you feel that Star Trek Discovery is more utilitarian in that sense?
What I think is interesting about it is that I would call it pre-ethical. You know, that classical dichotomy of Kantian ethics versus utilitarian ethics happens in an ethical society, in a civilized society, as Thomas Hobbes would call it. I think you can look at the situation of the Federation being at war, whether it's the Romulan War, whether it's the Klingon War, even the war with the Dominion in Deep Space Nine, as a kind of pre-ethics. You know, that Kantian ethics versus utilitarian ethics almost don't apply. If it's literally us versus them, we're not talking about Kantian ethics. We're not talking about utilitarian ethics. We're talking about survival, and Hobbes would say that is a pre-ethical state.
Yeah.
So I do think that generally, if you tend to think that something like genocide is justified in a time of war, you're probably using something like utilitarian thinking. You're thinking that, well, we're going to sacrifice this many millions of people to save this many more millions of our people. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, some type of utilitarian reasoning is probably going on there. If you're a Kantian, you're going to say, no, it's never justified, even if it leads to your own demise.
Right.
So I wouldn't say it's Kantian at all. I would say these kinds of things. And I would say that season 1 of Discovery is similar to all of Star Trek Enterprise, or at least Enterprise in the Xindi conflict.
The third season. I agree. I had the same thought.
I would say this is still very much in the post 9/11 mindset. We're almost 18 years after 9/11, but I think the dramatic appeal of these kinds of issues are enabled by post 9/11 thinking, and I would say Enterprise laid the groundwork for this a bit, and Discovery is taking it to a greater level.
Yeah, and let me add the latter seasons of Deep Space Nine. I think when the Dominion War really began to heat up, and it was an us versus them, and we see a Starfleet captain make what some might consider a questionable choice in order to try and tip the scale, so to speak, in that conflict. So, I think there's a lot of that type of writing within Star Trek Discovery.
What's missing for me in it is the kind of Picard nobility. You know, the ability to kind of rise above being dragged down into that kind of thinking or that kind of conflict. You know, the gray moral area of that situation. I think it would be almost more interesting to have a Picard type character in the situation that Michael Burnham is in, or in the situation that Lorca is in, or in the situation that Captain Giorgio is in.
And so I agree with you, but I think that the reason that is that, let's face it, the entire first season of Discovery is heavily influenced by a character from the Mirror Universe. Mm-hmm. And a good portion of this first series actually takes place in the Mirror Universe. And so I think the darkness that you're sensing, and certainly I did as well, I think comes from a place of, you know, this is heavily influenced by the Mirror Universe. What I'm going to be interested in as a Star Trek fan, and let's speculate and look into our Star Trek crystal ball here, I'm going to be interested to see what happens in season 2, because we're getting what many people consider to be kind of a quintessential noble Starfleet captain in
Captain Pike.
Captain Pike. I mean, we know so little about him, and yet we hold him up in such lore. I mean, we put him on a pedestal.
Even though he just wants to ride horses and have a picnic lunch? Come on.
It amazes me how much we put this very little known character on this pedestal, and we consider him Star Trek nobility. I'm going to be interested to see how he influences Discovery throughout the second season.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if he's more of an idealist in the Picard sense, or is he more of a pragmatist in the Kirk sense, right? Kirk is almost more of a pragmatist in that way. You know, Kirk, bends the rules to his whims based on pragmatic needs. Is he more of a Kirk? Sure. Or is he more of a Picard?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a lot of what they do in the second season. You know, for me, I think it's going to be interesting to see if he is this kind of pivotal character that literally drags Dante kind of out of hell and rights the ship, so to speak.
So you're thinking of Pike as being the Virgil to Michael Burnham's Dante.
That's exactly the point I'm making. I really think that he will, and I'm speculating here, I'm thinking and I'm hoping to some degree that he will be a Virgil character to bring Discovery a little closer to the Star Trek universe that most of us are used to. So Zachary, with that, I'm going to present my final episode, and I'm, again, just surprised. I think this is the first time that there hasn't been any concourse between our picks. Absolutely zero here. My final episode is Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad. And I'm not going to say a great deal about it except to say that my interest in this is honestly for the same reason I absolutely love the TNG episode Cause and Effect. Again, I'm an author, and I'm writing a series of time travel novels. The first one's due to come out in October, and I love this trope, this concept of time and how time passes and how time can be influenced and changed. And, they're at a party and they're having a great time, and Mud shows up and messes it all up. And somebody says to him, "You're mad." He says, "I'm Mud." What a great line. And I was never a big fan of the Mud character until Discovery, and he is such a delicious villain. I know there's a lot of people out there that are saying he shouldn't even be a part of this series. I disagree. I think they've done a great job, just like they did a great job when they took O'Brien and Worf and put them in DS9. I think it's equally incredible that they've taken Mud and they've put him in the Discovery universe, and he's such a great villain. And he's messed everything up, and they're reliving these moments over and over again, trying to fix it. And I find that very, very interesting conceptually. I think it touches on a lot of the philosophical buttons that really kind of get me thinking and get my juices flowing.
I think science fiction in general is an interesting state of affairs, right? We're past the classical golden age of science fiction. Science fiction is a mature genre at this point, which means that there have been time travel stories and time loop stories for decades now. So it's hard to come up with a new idea if you're attracted to that kind of storytelling. And Mike, if this episode had been in existence when we did Metatrek's episode 33, All Threes, and we talked about the metaphysics of time and time travel and different takes on the metaphysics of time inside Star Trek, we certainly would have talked about this episode as well.
Again, I have nothing special to say about Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad, except to say that all for the reasons that we discussed in that episode of Metatrek's, I love this episode. It had to go on my list because it is one of those science fiction tropes that I'm interested in, fascinated with, and never grow tired of.
Do you sometimes grow weary of this kind of story, though, as much as you love them? Do you have the reaction of like, oh, not another time loop story?
I don't. And the reason I say that is because I think each one of these stories brings an element or an idea to the table, and the story has a tendency to go in an unexpected direction. You know that at the end of the episode they're going to figure this conundrum out, and they're going to solve the puzzle, and everything's going to be okay. I mean, after all, that's what it's all about. They can't ultimately end up destroying in this case, the Discovery. That would end the series. So they're going to work it out. The conundrum will be solved. But looking at all of the different ideas that are brought to the table and how to do that, and how different characters, I love the fact that it starts out with just a couple of characters, but as they enlist the help of others, they tip the scales. And I think that is something that we didn't see in the TNG episode Cause and Effect. Mm-hmm. They were all working together from the very beginning to solve the puzzle. The thing that I love about this is that it was Michael Burnham learning to trust people. I think that this is about working together to solve a puzzle. It's about coming together and trusting one another. So I think that's a little different than what we get, say, in Cause and Effect.
I guess that's the reason it didn't actually make my list, though. It's an interesting story. It's a new take on a causal loop story or a time loop story. It's important for character development for a number of characters, but it doesn't seem to have anything new to say about the nature of time itself. Like, so from the standpoint of the philosophy of time or the metaphysics of time, does it add anything to the discussion that hasn't already been discussed or raised in previous versions of Star Trek or previous, even non-Star Trek, any sort of science fiction time loop story? Does this episode add anything to the metaphysics of time, not just the character development of the characters involved in the situation?
Yeah, and if I were looking at it strictly from a philosophical point of view, yeah, I suppose it would get old. But as a storyteller myself, I do have a great interest in how characters are developed and how they form bonds and build friendships and solve problems. And so that to me is what keeps these causal loop, time loop episodes fresh. So Zachary, as we wind down, any final thoughts about season 1 of Star Trek Discovery?
I would say that my relation to the first season of Star Trek Discovery is complicated because I would say it embodies all the things I love and all the things I hate about Star Trek all at the same time. And the things I love about it are not the things that I find philosophically interesting. I love the epicness of it. I like the existential questions that are raised by it. I don't like this variety of storytelling so much. I prefer much more episodic television. I like the optimism and the idealism and the brightness of 1990s Star Trek. It's to some degree why I honestly like the Orville a bit more than I like Discovery so far, although I haven't seen season 2 yet. Season 2 is about to start. Maybe my opinion will change here in a couple of days. I feel like in some places the first season of Star Trek Discovery is a little philosophically sloppy. It's wildly speculative, only loosely grounded in certain scientific ideas that are interesting notions, but not super well grounded or well fleshed out. It does an interesting job of drawing out some of the logical consequences of those ideas, like emergence, like the spores and biology being related to physics, and these speculative ideas like panpsychism and vitalism and all the stuff we talked about when we were talking about Context is for Kings. I find the fact that those ideas are being brought into Star Trek very interesting. I just feel like the kind of logical reasoning about those ideas is just falls short for me. There's just huge speculative leaps that don't really work for me in the way that other tech and other speculative science in Star Trek doesn't seem as wildly implausible. I have a hard time explaining why that is, because all those other things are wildly speculative as well. So what's the difference? Maybe I just don't like the style of storytelling as much as other people do. Where else I see the first season struggling a bit philosophically is to find something new to say about well-trodden territory. Yes, there's a causal loop story, but what does it say about the metaphysics of time that hasn't already been said? Yes, we have the mirror universe, but what does this version of the mirror universe say about personal identity in a way that hasn't already been covered all the way back in the 1960s in Mirror Mirror? Mm-hmm. I guess I'm looking for not just for dramatic development, but I'm looking for the development of ideas about those concepts. And I feel like the first season falls a little short, even as dramatically compelling as it is. And I love the epic quality of it. That's something I do like. As I approach middle age, I find myself more attracted to epics and more attracted to existential questions than when I was younger. And I like those elements of the first season of Discovery. I just feel like it's either a little sloppy and speculative in terms of the development of ideas, or it doesn't make any effort at all to develop those ideas and those concepts further beyond mere dramatic development. And of course, this is a storytelling. So from a storytelling standpoint, those stories are great and they're unique and they're interesting. They're different than what's been in Star Trek before. But what about the ideas? I've always loved idea-based Star Trek, and I feel like the first season of Discovery just falls a little flat from an idea development standpoint.
I echo, Zachary, a lot of what you said. I love the epic nature of Star Trek Discovery. And as a storyteller, I have a great appreciation for the storytelling. I agree with you that, by and large, I think the philosophy of Star Trek Discovery, at least season 1, is short of what my expectations are as a Star Trek fan and what I hope to gain by sitting down and watching an episode. I miss the episodic nature of television. Don't get me wrong. I like long arcs. I've always enjoyed episodes, for instance, of Deep Space Nine that were 2 and 3 part episodes. And for that matter, I'm actually a fan of the 3rd season of Enterprise, where we more or less had a whole season dedicated to this overall story arc, but we stopped oftentimes and we told episodic stories. And I realized that a lot of that had to do with what was going on in the world of writing at that time, with writer strikes and things that were going on politically in Hollywood. But I have an appreciation. I'm an old dude. I said at the top of the podcast, I'm an old dude. I like episodic television. So I too missed that about Star Trek Discovery. But as a storyteller, I love the stories that you're telling. I love the epic nature of it. Philosophically, there are some things here that I really love and appreciate. The existentialism, I think that is represented overall in, and I keep saying this, I feel almost like a broken record today, but this overall theme of identity and existentialism, I think that is this large arc that takes place, I think is brilliant. And I love the way that they did that with Michael Burnham. And, we have these other characters that have their own stories and arcs and discoveries to be made. And yet they are support characters for Michael Burnham's journey. And so I found that satisfying. I did notice that the animal ethics and the metaphysics of time and some of these things, I think that they tried to bring in, but like you, I wish they would have said something new. I wish they would have brought something new to the table to stimulate me mentally, philosophically, to kind of get my juices flowing, and they really didn't. But I'm not necessarily disappointed in Discovery, because I think they did such a great job telling an epic story. And so as an author, as a storyteller, I'm satisfied with that.
Well, Star Trek is always a mirror of our times, and we live in very pragmatic times.
Yes.
Even in the world of education that I work in professionally, we don't live in educationally optimistic times. We live in educationally pragmatic times. You get a higher education degree in order to get a good job, or order to meet some learning objectives, or order to fill in the blank, some practical reason, right? Not for its own sake. The idea of that sort of liberal arts ideal of education for its own sake is not something that is the forefront of the discussion right now. And so I think the pragmatic issues in Discovery, the sociological issues, the psychological issues, the human issues in Discovery are front and center. They're interesting. That's where the character development is. That's where the storytelling is. That's what people are finding compelling. But that leaves aside this kind of, highly speculative, philosophically idealistic, ivory tower, queen of the disciplines way of thinking about philosophy. And anyone that knows me professionally and philosophically knows that I'm not one to draw artificial dividing lines between disciplines. Philosophy is related to sociology, and philosophy is related to psychology in lots of ways. But here I feel like all the interesting stuff in Discovery for me is the sociological stuff, or the psychological development, the character development. That's where the uniqueness is happening, not so much in the sort of pure philosophical idealism of it. Is that a criticism? For me, I just don't find it as interesting as I find other varieties of Star Trek for those reasons, as much as I enjoy the storytelling and as much as I'm enjoying the epic quality of it.
So Zachary, before we wrap up today, I want to share our complete list, just kind of recap our picks for Essential Trek Philosophy, Discovery Season 1. So they are Context is for Kings, The Vulcan Hello / Battle of the Binary Stars, The Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry and Choose Your Pain, the episode Lethe, the episode Will You Take My Hand, and the episode Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad. And that, Zachary, is an epic list of Essential Trek Philosophy from Star Trek Discovery, Season 1.
Well, in a few months, when we get around to doing Essential Trek Philosophy from Star Trek Discovery Season 2, I look forward to having this discussion again and finding out everything we said that was wrong. How we've changed our mind and all the critiques and all the things we had to say that we didn't like about Star Trek Discovery from a philosophical standpoint, and how it all comes together next season.
I am looking forward to that discussion.
But in the meantime, it's been fun talking about Essential Trek Philosophy from Star Trek Discovery Season 1, but this isn't the only thing we've been discussing here on the network, so here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek.fm.
Previously on Trek.fm, Earl Grey.
I really hope they made an announcement to evacuate the forward part of the saucer section.
Well, he instructed Troy, and so she would, of course, given the command silently.
Yeah, but there was no time. There was no time.
Yeah,
It didn't seem like there was much time.
No, there wasn't.
She did it. Don't
it was
even
like,
question
be
it.
prepared to do it, and like 30 seconds later, they were ramming the thing.
Yep, plenty of time.
Okay.
Those people on serving on board, they know if they say move, you move immediately.
Literary Treks.
I love that it's not just, Keith DeCandido is playing the long game here, and we get these threads woven through all these stories, and it's not just, dumped on you all at once. It's a really nice, slow, methodical way to tell a story, and I'm loving it.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
He's equating survival with winning. But again, because we know the end, he needs to survive and not die in the war so he can get back to the mirror universe. And I just love seeing that.
Yeah, it's great, because if you just see this on the surface and don't know the ending, it's true.
Warp 5.
Problem with Section 31 is it is not an official organization. It is extra legal. It does not answer to any authority. It does not answer to any oversight. Officially, it doesn't exist.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on your iPhone, iPad, Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most third-party podcast apps. And you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link as well. Well, we'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode of Metatreks, and there are many ways for you to share your thoughts with us. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the contact form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose Message to a Trek FM Show and select Metatreks. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. Well, Mike, speaking of contact information, when you're not avoiding Captain Lorca like Odysseus avoided the Scylla and Charybdis, where can our listeners find you on the interwebs and around the Trek FM network?
Well, Zachary, you can always find me on Facebook. That's where I'm most active. I'm also pretty active on Twitter, as well as Instagram. My Twitter handle is @CMichael1701. Instagram, I'm CMichael1701. And Zachary, when you're not peddling prepaid long-distance mind meld cards, where can our listeners find you around Trek FM and on the interwebs?
Yeah, don't you know I get $1 spiff for every one of those? Well, you can find me elsewhere on Trek.fm as co-host of To The Journey, Trek FM show dedicated to all things Star Trek Voyager. You can also find me in the Babel Conference if you'd like to talk about Star Trek and philosophy with me in there, and you're welcome to follow me on Twitter. My handle is just my name, @Zachary Fruhling. That's Zachary, Z-A-C-H-A-R-Y, Fruhling, F-R-U-H-L-I-N-G. Well, if you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, we invite you to become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM, that's patreon.com/TrekFM, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and many more, all available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of time and money to produce, host, and distribute these podcasts each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. We'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Metatrex team from around the network. Specifically, we would like to thank C. Brian Jones, the founder and publisher of Trek.fm, or is that Mirror C. Brian Jones? You be the judge. Our executive producers, Matthew Rushing and Kenneth Tripp, Aaron Harvey, our art director, Richard Marquez, our production manager, and Brandon Shea Mutala, our Patreon manager. And we'd like to give a special thank you and a shout out to our associate producers, Patrick Devlin. You can find Patrick under the Twitter handle at MagicDrop5. Kay Shaw, my former co-host of To The Journey. You can find her on Twitter at Choco Weeble. Norman Lau at Starfighter1701. And Mark Walker at Mark74656. And Mike, we'd like once more to invite our listeners to discover more about our sponsor, Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and to get your seat on the mission. And check out audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. Well, everyone, thanks for listening to Metatrex, a Star Trek and philosophy podcast. Until next time, when we will once again boldly go where no philosophers have gone before.
Or tardigrades.